Welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. I'm Harriet Frew, eating disorder therapist, here to support you in overcoming disordered eating and finding peace with food. So today I want to dive into talking about attachment style and eating disorders. I just want to give a shout out to the attachmentproject.com, which has been a great resource as I am gathering information to do this podcast. So that's the attachmentproject.com. Thank you for putting out some incredible information. So let's dive in. So when we're young, we develop templates for how the world works and how we fit into it. So this is based on our early relationships with our caregivers. So if we had caregivers who were emotionally supportive, comforting, available to our emotional needs during times of stress, and during important developmental changes, we develop a secure attachment style. And as a result of this support, if you have a secure attachment style, you're taught that you're adequate and you're valuable, you're good enough. In comparison, if we grew up with caregivers who are inconsistent or rejecting of our needs, we may have started to see ourselves as inadequate or unlovable. Consequently, we may have developed one of the three insecure attachment styles, which are anxious, avoidant, or disorganized. Now, just want to stress before I go into explaining a bit more about the different attachment styles, it's often no one's fault if you didn't get your needs adequately met. Okay, often if you think about maybe a parent who's dealing with a bereavement, financial worries, maybe they have a lot going on, maybe there's other siblings and they have a young baby who's crying. You know, the baby, they may not be very attuned to that baby. They may be very stressed out and preoccupied. And when they pick up the baby and the baby is looking to the parent for eye contact and responsiveness, if the parent is very distracted and stressed and dealing with 100 things at once, they just may not be very tuned in. They may not be responding to that baby. And the baby, if it receives that experience again and again and again, it will start to kind of feel more insecure, less seen. And again, just want to really stress that as parents, I'm a parent myself, we are imperfect with our parenting and we are not going to be perfectly attuned to our children all of the time, okay? You only have to be a good enough parent. You don't have to be perfect, okay? But it's when it's consistently, when we consistently, if you've experienced your emotional needs, your attunement being overlooked consistently, that's probably going to mean that you have a more insecure attachment style. It's very hard to sort of trust in a way that you can get your needs met from other humans. And I guess we form those early relationships with our caregivers. So it's usually our mother and father, but may not be. You may be in a different situation. You may have other people who cared for you. It's also other people that were very influential in our early life. So it can sometimes be grandparents or aunts and uncles or siblings or even teachers, anyone in our sort of circle who had a strong influence. And having even one protective influence, even if things weren't great at home, if you had a really strong relationship with a grandparent, maybe that can be almost like a saving grace where you had someone who really showed up and saw you. Okay, so yeah, we don't have to kind of feel completely overwhelmed and give up on everything if we just think, oh, my home life was just not great. Hopefully you may have had glimmers of support from somewhere, but maybe not. Okay, it's helpful to reflect though. So let's talk about different types of attachment. So first of all, secure attachment. So secure attachment is the result of feeling secure with your caregivers from childhood and being able to ask for reassurance or validation without punishment. So ultimately you feel safe, understood, comforted and valued during your early interactions. And your caregivers were probably emotionally available, aware of their own emotions and behaviours. Hence, children imitate secure attachment as well as receiving it from caregivers. So signs of a secure attachment can include things like an ability to regulate your own emotions, to easily trust others, to have effective communication skills, ability to seek emotional support, comfortable being alone, comfortable in close relationships, ability to self-reflect in partnerships, being easy to connect with, being able to manage conflict well, have high self-esteem and ability to be emotionally available. So when we have a secure attachment, if you were brought up in an environment where you were able to develop a secure attachment, it's really a golden gift, because it means that you see the world as a much more trusting and safe place. And because you see it as a much more trusting and safe place, you kind of go out into the world with a trusting and safe lens on the world. So you tend to be able to reach out to people more, to be more open, to believe really that people can meet your needs, that they can be responsive, that relationships are a great thing. And you will be doing all of this unconsciously, but your life will probably be so much easier in many ways if you have had a secure attachment from early on. So securely attached people grow up feeling secure emotionally and physically, and can engage with others in the world in a healthy way. And they tend to then navigate relationships well and experience healthy mental well-being. They're generally positive, trusting and loving to their partners, and they tend to trust their partner's intentions. Jealousy is less of an issue, and people who are securely attached feel that they're worthy of love and don't need that sort of external reassurance all the time. So that's the secure attachment. What about avoidant attachment style? So avoidant, it's defined by failures. That's quite a strong word actually, but an inability, I guess, to be able to build long-term relationships with others due to an inability to engage in physical and emotional intimacy. So the failure, in inverted commas, to build relationships is not like a kind of personal fault that there's something wrong with you. It's almost that you don't have the kind of faith and trust that relationships are things that stay around and that are safe. And so it's very hard to kind of trust that it's going to happen. So you'll probably show up in the relationship in a way where you don't really expect people to stay around and be there for you. So if you have an avoidant attachment style, in childhood, you may have had strict or emotionally distant or even absent carers. So your caregivers may have left you to fend for yourself, expected you to be very independent, really perhaps told you off if you depended on them, rejected you when you expressed your needs or emotions, and perhaps been slow to respond to your basic needs. So some avoidant kind of producing parents can be outright neglectful, but others as well are simply busy, slightly disinterested, and perhaps more concerned with things like grades, chores, or manners than feelings, hopes, dreams, or fears. So as a result, children tend to develop a strong sense of independence, so they don't have to rely on anyone else for care and support. So if you have an avoidant attachment style, you might persistently avoid emotional or physical intimacy, feel that strong sense of independence, be uncomfortable with expressing your feelings, maybe being dismissive of other people if they're vulnerable, have a hard time trusting people, and feel very threatened by anyone who tries to get close to you, spend more time alone than interacting with others, and believe that you don't need others in your life, because you've almost like had to survive from very early on without other people. So you become this kind of lone wolf, this island. And how does this show up? So if someone's in a relationship and they are avoidant, when other people tend to get close to them, it doesn't feel very safe and they will tend to withdraw. It almost like activates the nervous system in a way where someone, this isn't familiar, it doesn't feel safe, so they really would withdraw. Okay, so what about an anxious attachment style? So if you are anxiously attached, you have a strong fear of rejection, a strong fear of abandonment, a tendency to perhaps be codependent, and you depend a lot on your partner for validation and emotional regulation. So this attachment style stems from inconsistent parenting that isn't attuned to a child's needs. So often what happens is maybe the care has been a bit inconsistent in terms of the parent might be really, really close and warm and validating one day, but then they might be quite cold and distant another day. So the child learns in a way that they can't really predict what's going to happen and they don't feel safe. So children as well with this attachment style experience very high distress when their caregivers leave. And sometimes these parents will be supportive and responsive to the child's needs, while at other times they're not very attuned. So if you have an anxious attachment style, Your parents may have alternated between being kind of perhaps overly coddling and then maybe being detached or indifferent. Perhaps they're easily overwhelmed, sometimes attentive, sometimes pushing you away, and perhaps made you feel responsible for how they felt. So therefore, these children often grow up thinking they're supposed to take care of other people's feelings, and they can become codependent. So signs that you might have an anxious attachment style include being clingy, highly sensitive to criticism, needing approval from others, jealousy sometimes, difficulty being alone, low self-esteem, feeling unworthy of love, feeling intense fear of rejection, significant fear of abandonment, and difficulty trusting others. So this can often lead as well to a lot of anxiety in relationships, so decreases relationship satisfaction, and someone can become really, really clingy in a relationship, just be really terrified the other person's going to leave. And then what often happens as well, very interesting in relationships, is anxious people and avoidant people are often attracted to each other because they're almost the perfect kind of magnet, really. And that can just be very, very difficult in relationships. And then the last attachment style is a disorganized attachment style, which is like a combination of the anxious and the avoidant. So I won't go through all of that in lots of detail, but you can just imagine really like a combination of both of the last two insecure types that I've talked about. So essentially, our early attachment style that is formed is then very influential in our relationships as we progress through life, because once you have an attachment style kind of formed, you're very likely to sort of be in that attachment style, and you're not going to change really until you probably do some work on yourself, you become aware. Maybe if you are avoidant or anxious, maybe you meet someone who's very securely attached and that relationship is a real container for healing. But it usually needs some like conscious changes to shift your attachment style, but that is very, very possible. And I guess what's interesting as well is whatever your attachment style as well, if you are more secure, it acts as a really positive buffer against potential psychological harm. So as you're growing up, if you have a secure attachment style, you're going to choose like better romantic partners, you're going to choose better friends, because you're going to go out in the world and be attracting people in a way who are also secure, who can also show up for you, who can communicate well, who are trusting, etc. Whereas if you have a more insecure attachment style, you are more likely to go for the people that are emotionally avoidant, possibly people that are abusive, etc., because it feels more familiar. Because as humans, our conscious mind may think, I want to have a healthy relationship, but we often go with what's familiar because the unconscious runs the show. So let's talk a bit about attachment theory and eating disorders. So essentially, having an insecure attachment style is a confirmed risk factor for developing an eating disorder. Now, that may sound like a blanket statement, but studies have shown that roughly 70 to 100% of people with anorexia also have an insecure attachment style. They also show that insecure attachment styles predispose individuals to other forms of eating disorders too. And what's more, this discovery wasn't only in people diagnosed with a specific eating disorder. Insecure attachment was also found to be a risk factor for disordered eating patterns. So obviously not a full-blown eating disorder diagnosis even, but some patterns such as chronic restrained eating, compulsive eating, heightened focus on appearance. And also there is evidence to suggest that insecure attachment is a risk factor for the signs of an eating disorder before it actually manifests. So these signs include concerns about weight, dissatisfaction with body shape, restricting eating, binge eating. So therefore, it could be said that eating disorder symptoms are the outward expression of the deep psychological and emotional issues that often result from insecure attachment styles. And I am fully on board with this, because I think it's always not really about food, it's about feelings. And when we don't have secure attachments with other humans and with ourselves, we will tend to focus on something else to offer safety. So, for the sake of this podcast, is usually food, body image issues, but other people may use alcohol, gambling, drugs, work addiction, a whole manner of other coping strategies. Now, of course, not everyone with an insecure attachment style has an eating disorder, and not everyone with an eating disorder has an insecure attachment. So having an insecure attachment style alone may be not sufficient explanation for why some people develop an eating disorder or not. However, I guess we see in eating disorders a lot of emotional dysregulation, maybe difficulties with perfectionism, low self-esteem, unhealthy coping mechanisms, all impact the development of eating disorders. And all of these are associated with insecure attachment. So what's more, each of these factors also maintains and strengthens eating disorder symptoms. So 4 reasons why insecure attachers might develop eating disorders. So number 1, emotional dysregulation. So if you have an insecure attachment style, you tend to have difficulty regulating negative emotions. So for this reason, it can be really drawn into using unhealthy coping strategies to manage feelings. So for instance, someone high in attachment avoidance tends to push down or inhibit their emotions. And in contrast, people high in attachment anxiety tend to heighten theirs. Now, I know myself, when I had bulimia was very much a mirror of how I was dealing with my emotions. I was with food oscillating between being very restrictive, very clean, very controlled, or being completely in absolute chaos, binging, eating everything in sight, being completely kind of dysfunctional, chaotic, all over the place. And this also mirrored really my emotional world. I was either kind of the happy-go-lucky, everything is so wonderful on the outside kind of person sailing through life, seeming that they didn't have a care in the world, and then behind closed doors sometimes I could just be absolutely chaotic. The world would be ending, everything would be kind of coming out of the seams, and it was completely one extreme and the other. So definitely very emotionally dysregulated. And I would say I definitely had an anxious attachment style. And interestingly as well, I want to say about attachment styles is that I think that they can, our different attachment styles can vary a bit as well, depending on who we're in relationship with. Like, I know for myself, when I was very in the sort of bulimia, very chaotic phase, I would definitely had a very anxious attachment, and I would be very attracted to avoidant people because that was almost like the perfect magnet. But then, subsequent to that, I had been in other relationships where I was probably the more avoidant one and was being kind of chased by someone who was more anxious. So it's really interesting. And I mean, thankfully, I consider myself today to be pretty much in a secure place most of the time, but I've really had to do some work on it. So it's plausible to propose that some insecurely attached people attempt to reduce the negative feelings about themselves through behaviours such as dieting to achieve the perfect body, binge eating to distract and increase mood, and purging to avoid weight gain. And these actions serve as a form of escapism, allowing people relief from their painful emotions. And I guess I just want to say as well, this is often quite unconscious. But what happens is these behaviours don't alleviate the insecure attacher's negative feelings for very long. The cycle of behaviours is triggered every time they face distress or upset. Okay, number 2, inaccurate self-beliefs. As a result of how insecure attachers' needs were not met or not met in childhood, they often develop inaccurate beliefs about themselves. So they often think maybe I'm worthless, I'm not good enough, I'm unlovable. So these dysfunctional self-beliefs may lead these people to excessively compare themselves to others whom they see as better. And because they are incapable of accurately seeing themselves for who they truly are, this comparison often worsens, and the self-image decreases and promotes disordered eating in an attempt to feel better about themselves. Furthermore, an insecure bond with caregivers may lead insecure attachers to search for connections with alternative sources, which in some cases may lead to obsessions with celebrities. This infatuation may also lead to a comparison effect. This in turn could lead to a negative body image, over-exercising, preoccupation with food and diet. Number 3, perfectionism. Insecure attachers may be particularly prone to perfectionism. Some may develop certain aesthetic standards, such as striving for thinness or trying to achieve perfect muscles. What's more, the perfectionism associated with insecure attachment causes people to be overly self-critical. Therefore, unhealthy eating patterns may help someone with an insecure attachment feel like they're coming to terms with their dissatisfaction with their body type or weight. It's also possible that insecure attachers hope to achieve outward acceptance and approval by achieving a perfect standard. But if they do not reach these physical goals, which is almost impossible to do, isn't it? Their frustration with their body shape increases. I find this is so true in the therapy room. In a way, the more someone has been striving to change their shape and their weight, etc., they become increasingly dissatisfied. It never feels good enough. And if someone's trying to achieve physical perfection, very high risk of developing eating disorders. And number 4, reduce mindfulness. It's also possible that with insecure attachment styles, you are less aware and accepting of the present moment. So insecure attachers tend to engage in emotional processes such as worrying, ruminating, or denying. And all of these processes take the individual out of the present. And this difficulty in achieving a mindful state strongly affects some people's ability to recognize hunger, satiety, and also feel accepting of their weight and body shape, all of which are particularly present in disorders such as bulimia and binge eating. Okay, let's talk about specific attachment styles and eating disorders. So the evidence supporting the link between attachment theory and eating disorders is strong. And yet, the association between different attachment styles and particular eating disorders is still inconclusive. Therefore, most of the available information discusses eating disorders and insecure attachment more generally rather than in relation to specific eating disorders. So, first of all, anxious attachment and eating disorders. So, anxious attachers are prone to heightened emotions and often struggle with managing their intense feeling of distress around their negative sense of self. They expect to be rejected or abandoned by those close to them, so they often have an increased need for approval. And this may result in setting unrealistically high standards for themselves and comparing themselves to others. So these attitudes leave anxious attachers particularly at risk for eating disorders, and they're also prone to experiencing increased severity of symptoms. And what's more, the emotional hunger associated with the attachment style may be a risk factor for the binging and purging cycle of bulimia. So it's almost like the kind of desperate attempt to just take in like love, connection, support, etc. Desperately wanting that, but then also feeling really undeserving and unworthy of it and almost like rejecting it. So bulimia can be a mirror of that dynamic going on. Number 2, avoidant attachment and eating disorders. Avoidant attachers learn to cope with the feeling that their needs were rejected as children by shutting down their attachment system, forging a sense of self-reliance and a general distrust of others. For these reasons, it is unsurprising that the evidence suggests that an avoidant attacher's tendency to detach or distance themselves from distressing emotions essentially represents a turning away from painful experiences, similar to the way that someone with anorexia denies their physical hunger. As a result, the avoidant attachment style may explain the strict dietary habits that someone with an eating disorder tends to engage in. Additionally, avoidant attachers tend to set high standards, perfectionism, which may put them further at risk of developing an eating disorder. Number 3, disorganized attachment and eating disorders. Issues associated with disorganized attachment, such as feelings of unresolved trauma and loss, may play a substantial role in the development of eating disorders. In fact, the greater the level of trauma in early years, the more serious the symptoms of an eating disorder tend to be. What's more, depending on whether a disorganized attacher falls more highly on the dimension of the anxious or the avoidant, may determine the form of unhealthy eating patterns or restrictions they engage in. For example, if they have more anxious symptoms, they may engage more in binging and purging to curb their feelings of distress. Moreover, if they fall more on the avoidant dimension, they may be more restrictive in an attempt to strive for the perfect aesthetic and detach from distressing emotions. Now, interesting as well, some information about caregiver behaviours and eating disorders. So some of the main highlights from research on why someone develops an eating disorder is a level of confusion around how caregivers behave, as well as how caregivers manage their teenagers' burgeoning desires for independence. So let's take a look at these factors and how they can become risk factors for eating disorders. So disrupted attempts for independence can be a risk factor for eating disorders. Now, I know for me, this is very much part of my story. I really wanted to sort of leave home, go off to uni, sort of, have some independence. But my dad really wanted me to stay at home, do the family business, work on the farm. And I really felt, because I really loved my dad, a strong sense of obligation to doing that, and felt very, very guilty for wanting to sort of take my own path. So for me, with bulimia, it wasn't just about this, but the bulimia was a way of sort of coping with that, the real chaos and conflict around those different feelings. So it's very normal, isn't it? As teenagers, we start to strive for independence. We attempt to redefine our relationships with our caregivers in line with our adolescent needs. Now, this is often easier said than done. And I think, as a parent myself, I know it's not an easy job to parent a teenager. So that need for independence can often create an internal struggle for a teen. So on the one hand, they want freedom and control of their own lives. But on the other hand, they really want comfort and support from their caregivers. And as a result of this battle of needs, a teenager can often feel like a lot of inner stress and conflict. So this internal battle can only be resolved when caregivers and teens openly communicate thoughts, feelings, and needs with each other. Now, however, the ability to do that in any family is greatly influenced by the type of attachment bond that a teenager and a caregiver share. So you can see if there's like a secure attachment bond there, communication is going to be so much easier because there's trust, there's openness, there's hopefully calmness, ability to talk about feelings, all of those things. But actually, if there's like an anxious attachment or avoidant attachment or disorganized attachment, there's so much more potential for things to go wrong because there's not the level of trust there. There's going to be a lot of perhaps mixed communication, not feeling understood, can really, really easily go wrong. And I think a teenager can attempt to cope with their negative feelings around all of this in unhealthy ways, such as restricting food, and really striving for control. And actually, the eating disorder feels like one way that they can kind of claw back a sense of control. And I guess I just want to say here as well that teenagers developing eating disorders is not just all about the parents. There's many like complicated things going on, that there could be things going on at school or in friendship groups, much, much more. But the parent-carer dynamic can be one sort of segment of the pie. Interesting as well, and this is again from the attachment website, the mother's transmission of trauma may lead to eating disorders. Again, this is no one's fault. This is like an unconscious thing that happens. But a study on adult women with eating disorders determined that all the women involved were anxiously attached. The study further reported that these women felt a lack of unresolved trauma or loss, especially with their mothers. And this discovery aligns with the findings of other studies that discuss how a mother's unresolved personal trauma may impede her ability to respond to her child's needs sensitively. And as a result, transgenerational transmission of trauma may play a vital role in the development of an eating disorder. So it may broaden our understanding of how eating disorders develop if we not only consider a teenager's trauma, but also their mothers. And I guess it's really important to say that, mothers are often doing the absolute best they can at the time. And, mother might be carrying trauma from the relationship with her mother or her father or going back generations and generations. And back in the day, there was no support or understanding around mental health. People really had to just sort of suck it up and get on with it. So, I think that we've got whole generations who are kind of quite traumatized and have never had the support they needed around their mental health. So they've unconsciously passed things on. So, it's only with a much greater consciousness and awareness and how things are changing and the information age that we can start to look at things in a very, very different way. Anyway, okay, so I hope that has given you a bit of a taste of attachment and eating disorders. I guess I just really want to say to you that you can heal your attachment style. So if you recognize anything of yourself in this episode, you can really work on your attachment style and change it. It's something that I have definitely invested a lot of my time and energy into after a lot of very painful relationships, really, in my younger years. A really good book as well I would recommend is Attached. It's by Dr. Amir Levine and Rachel Heller. So attached, you can get that on Amazon or I guess most other places. Over 2 million copies sold. Would highly recommend that. Okay, thank you so much for being here today. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If you're not following me already on Instagram, do seek me out, the Eating Disorder Therapist _. And for further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. And if you enjoy this podcast, I'll be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.